Hi, everyone. Dr. Shook here. Hope you're doing great today. In today's podcast, I want to talk about an important issue, and that is digestive problems that don't improve despite making dietary changes or maybe even using temporary supplementation. And there are so many problems that can occur with the gut, with the digestive tract. And if you've listened to some of our more recent podcasts, I talk about an approach that I learned from one of my, one of my teachers, and one of the people that I respect in functional medicine the most, and that's Datis Karazian. And he teaches a model of looking at the gut from a top down model. And it is, once you learn that, once you understand, it just makes sense, and it's a brilliant way through which to look at this lens, looking at it from the mouth and chewing and salivation, and understanding the neurological mechanisms that actually drive digestion, and how some of those things, if you're not digesting properly, how it may actually be something that is closer to the top or the beginning of the digestive process. Maybe it's an issue with saliva production. Maybe it's an issue with neurodegeneration, where the nerve centers of the brainstem aren't properly activating the gut and stimulating it for digestion, and then therefore you have poor digestion. But what I really want to focus on in this particular podcast is looking at some very common drivers of digestive problems that just won't resolve. And the first thing that I want to focus on and I want to talk about is just this concept of GI tract autoimmunity. And the reason that we need to talk about this is because this is a very common reason that people have persistent digestive issues that don't resolve despite trying diets that may or may not help them, and despite using supplementation where they'll get mixed results. And GI autoimmunity is very important, and it's one of the things that I see pretty commonly, because most of the people that follow my teaching and the information that I share, they follow me because I talk a lot about Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune thyroid condition. It's the most common autoimmune condition in the world. And one of the things that I've seen in practice when working with people that have Hashimoto's is that they very, very frequently have at least one additional autoimmune condition. And it's not uncommon to learn that people have GI tract autoimmunity when they also have Hashimoto's. So this is really important to understand, especially if you're struggling with digestive symptoms that wax and wane, or that come and go, and you're not really sure why. So sometimes you have to dig a little bit deeper, but this is a real common problem in people that are autoimmune. And if you don't know this, there are 50 million people diagnosed with autoimmunity in the United States. That's 1 in 9 women and about 1 in 12 men. So it is a huge, huge issue. And one of the things that we know is that there was a research study that was put out, and I've got a link to it in the show notes. And also, if you're watching this on YouTube or one of the video formats, you can actually go to our references slide at the end of the presentation, and I have links, but I also have a link here that you can view directly in the slide if you can see this. But this is from a research paper that I found on PubMed, and they're really looking at people with thyroid autoimmunity, which they were looking at people that had Hashimoto's thyroiditis and Graves' disease, and they were trying to understand their rate, or the incidence rate of second or third autoimmune conditions. So they're trying to better understand the factors that might contribute to that, if there was an increased rate of autoimmunity. And what they found was that people with one autoimmune condition are more likely to have autoimmunity to at least one additional tissue. And they found that this was autoimmune conditions are also clustered in families. So what this tells you is, for one thing, if you have an autoimmune condition, it's not unlikely that you would have a second autoimmune condition. And if you're having problems with your gut, that's a possibility. The other thing here that I think is really important from this study is to understand that you should look at your other family members. If you have this as something that you're able to do, you should look at your other family members and see what other kind of health problems that they're dealing with. Are they dealing with autoimmune conditions? Do they have Do they have digestive problems? If so, what are the cause of their digestive issues? Because autoimmunity is clustered in families, so that tells us that there's a genetic component to autoimmunity. But we know that it's not just the genetics that contribute to autoimmune conditions. It's also this environmental the environmental exposures that trigger the genetics and result in the expression of the autoimmunity. So there's an environmental component, but there's also this genetic component. So if you have one autoimmune condition like Hashimoto's or Graves', there's a higher probability that you're going to have a second one. And you really want to consider, again, inflammatory bowel diseases, because for one thing, if you can catch them at an earlier stage, or any of these autoimmune conditions at an earlier stage, you're going to have, in a lot of cases, and it varies. It's so individualized. There's not much predictability that we have when working with autoimmunity, except that we tend to see that the earlier that you detect the autoimmune condition, there seems to be an improvement in your ability to control it and to slow expansion. But again, it's such an individualized thing that really you really just need to try and understand everything that you can about what's happening to your body, and try to inventory the factors that may be promoting what is happening to you, so that you can develop dietary, lifestyle, and, if appropriate, nutritional supplementation strategies to try and modulate that autoimmune process, so that you can live the very best life possible with the with a better chance of minimizing tissue destruction in the long term. At least that's how I think about it. So, this is something to definitely keep in mind. And if you have an autoimmune condition, or if you think you do, or if you're hypothyroid and you haven't been checked for Hashimoto's and you're listening to this, then you definitely need to be considering Hashimoto's disease, which is the most common cause of hypothyroidism or low thyroid conditions in the world. And you really need to be considering, could my digestion actually be because of an autoimmune process to my digestive tract? Now, when we're looking at autoimmune diseases to the digestive tract, there are three primary inflammatory bowel diseases that we really want to be thinking about here. There is celiac disease, ulcerative colitis, and Crohn's disease. Now, celiac disease is a full-blown immune response to gluten, and it causes severe GI tract damage. It can also result in what they call extra-intestinal manifestations, and that means that the process can result in problems with your body other than just the digestive tract, which a lot of people, they don't realize that, but there is quite a bit of research that has been done and that is ongoing to look at these extra intestinal manifestations. I have some links in, again, the references to the slideshow that you can look at. You can visit on PubMed, but there is quite a bit of interest in neurological autoimmunity and in bone and skin autoimmunity when someone has celiac disease. So these are all things that are really really important to look at and to consider when you're trying to understand and really get a lay of the land for what is happening with your body. Now, conventionally, your doctor may order a TTG antibody test, which is a tissue transglutaminase test. And when I was looking at some of the literature on this, I thought it was really interesting. I found on one of the websites I have in the references that there was some, I'll be looking at the accuracy of these celiac tests, or these tests for celiac disease, which typically looks at like a wheat antibody, which is usually like one of the gliadin portions of gliadin, which is a protein in wheat that the body makes the antibodies against. It looks at tissue transglutaminase. It looks at endomysial antibodies, which is like a smooth muscle of the intestine. And what they found with the tissue transglutaminase, which is an enzyme found in the intestinal lining, and it's one of the, if it's positive, it's very highly likely that you have celiac. Now, it needs to be confirmed by, through other tests. Typically, they'll do a biopsy and they'll look for what's called villus atrophy, where the little finger-like projections, or it's sometimes referred to as almost like a shag-like carpet surface of the cells inside the intestinal tract if they're damaged or shortened due to an inflammatory process. And the interesting thing about this was that the tissue transglutaminase antibodies may have as low as a 34% accuracy because of something called verification bias, where basically the test, if it comes back negative, uh, either the people that are doing the study, the researchers that are doing a study to look at at the, let's say, the incidence rate of celiac, they don't follow up the test if they get they may not do a follow up test to verify that the negative tissue transglutaminase was indeed a negative for celiac. It was a true indicator of being negative for celiac disease, because some people will actually have negative tissue transglutaminase and they'll still have celiac disease. So this verification bias is something that I thought was really interesting. So a lot of the tests that are done conventionally, like the blood testing I was mentioning for celiac panel, I think are really outdated, because there's so many different ways that the immune system can react to the protein gliadin and different components of wheat. So when you're looking for like a celiac disease workup and like, oh, could this be a problem for me? What should I consider doing? So first of all, you always need to see your medical doctor, because they're going to be able to help you figure out a starting point. Okay, and that's really important. So that's the first step. Period. So you don't pass that if you haven't done that. Go see your medical doctor. That's the first thing. I highly recommend, in addition to that, considering Cyrex Labs Array 3. Now, this array, it's a panel, a blood panel, and it looks at antibodies to different components of wheat. It looks at about 23 of the most reactive components of wheat, it is, as far as I know, and I've looked at a lot of different lab tests. A lot of different companies have sent me literature and approached me, to try and get me to utilize their testing. And there's a lot of good companies out there, so I definitely don't know them all, but I've looked at a lot of different panels, and Cyrex they really, in my mind, and from what I've seen, they set the bar for immunological testing. And this is like I think the very best panel that you can have for immunological reactivity to gluten that's available today. They also look at tissue transglutaminase, 3 different tissue transglutaminases, which I just mentioned in the previous. I just mentioned the intestinal tissue transglutaminase, but there's also transglutaminase found in other parts of the body. I believe it's the brain and the skin. And they look to see if there are antibodies there too. So it's also partially an autoimmune panel. So it's a fantastic panel. Now, if you haven't consumed gluten for, it's around 4 weeks or longer, like strictly gluten-free, then you may get some false negatives with this. So that's something to also keep in mind. But this is a great test. And when you really look at wheat, there's so much more to it that is not really being assessed with your standard conventional, like say celiac panel, for example, because it has over 100 components that could cause immune reactivity. So it's amazing the complexity of immunological reactivity to wheat. So this is something that I highly recommend. If you think you have celiac, if you've done genetic testing to see if you are genetically predisposed to celiac disease, I think this is even more important of a test to order. But this is the first place that I would consider starting, is seeing your medical doctor and then considering some further workups. And there are a lot of different diagnostic tests that they might do. I would just, if you get the conventional testing for celiac, I would, and you're still having digestive issues and you have a genetic predisposition, if you've had any of the genetic testing like 23andMe, for example, you can look to see, using that data, whether or not you have the genes that predispose you to celiac disease. Now, it doesn't mean you have it, but if you have a genetic predisposition, you're more susceptible, right? If the right environmental triggers there, you're more susceptible. So this is really an important thing to consider. And I included a link here, and it's also in the references, and I'll put it in the show notes if you look on YouTube or wherever we have our show notes posted. There is a link to celiac.org, and it's about celiac disease screening and diagnosis. And you can learn more more there. But I think this is a really important thing because a lot of people that have celiac disease also have Hashimoto's. So this is something that's, very relevant to you if you have an autoimmune condition, but especially if you have Hashimoto's. Second inflammatory bowel disease that I want to talk about is ulcerative colitis. Now, ulcerative colitis is an autoimmune disease. It creates a lot of destruction of the intestinal, of the intestine, in particular of the large intestine. And it will obviously, all of these inflammatory bowel diseases can create major, significant GI symptoms. Okay. It's interesting with celiac disease, some people have celiac disease, full-blown celiac disease, and don't have any symptoms. So that's important to remember as well. It's typically, it's something that occurs in the, typically in the upper small intestine, celiac disease. Now, ulcerative colitis is something that happens in the large intestine. So that's the last part of the intestine. And, the symptoms are usually different for these. But for sure, ulcerative colitis is another autoimmune condition that you can see occur if you have other diagnosed autoimmune conditions. Now, for an ulcerative colitis workup, same thing. Start with your medical doctor. Okay. Then after that, talk with them, and if they agree to it, if it's possible, then you should consider Cyrix Labs Array 5. It's a multiple tissue antibody panel. Okay, so this is a test that looks at over 20 human tissues to see if you have antibodies against them. So these antibodies, if you have antibodies that are against different tissues in your body, it doesn't mean that you have an autoimmune condition, but it increases the probability significantly. You got to remember, an autoimmune diagnosis is a clinical diagnosis. So it's not just positive antibodies. It's also clinical presentation plus positive antibodies. So you can't diagnose autoimmunity from that, but it is a very significant finding that would lead you towards the consideration and lead you towards further investigation of the tissue that you have antibodies against. Okay, so it is one of the best ways to, in my opinion, to screen for autoimmunity against various tissues throughout the body. And so it's a great thing because there are 3 stages of autoimmunity. Stage 1 is basically silent, where you have these antibodies that form, but there are no symptoms, and the tissue that the antibodies have formed against is still functioning. Okay, stage 2 is where you become symptomatic. It's where you have antibodies against the tissue, you have symptoms associated with the tissue, but the tissue has not yet failed. Stage 3 is where you have antibody symptoms and the tissue has failed. Now, in a situation like this, we could use Hashimoto's as an example, which is an autoimmune thyroid condition. In this situation, the immune system, if you want to use an example for stage 3, Hashimoto's is a good one, where the immune system, if it's attacking the gland, you'll have antibodies, and then you'll typically have antibodies. Let me say that. You won't always have them, but typically you have antibodies present. The tissue will show visible destruction, maybe even swelling if you palpate it. If you do an ultrasound, you typically see scarring, maybe even some atrophy, and you'll see low thyroid hormone output, so the gland is failing. So that would be a stage 3. And you can look more into that. I have other videos on stages of autoimmunity, but definitely with ulcerative colitis, I don't want to digress too far from the workup. See your medical doctor. I highly recommend Cyrix Labs Array 5 that looks at the anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibodies and also anti-Saccharomyces cerevisiae antibodies. And these are typically markers for bowel autoimmunity or for GI tract autoimmunity. And you can look up, if you want to understand better the medical workup, you can go to emedicine.medscape.com, and I have a link again in the show notes, and also if you watch the video, you can view the link. The third inflammatory bowel disease I want to talk about is Crohn's disease. Now, Crohn's disease is an autoimmune destruction of the small and or large intestine, but it can affect any part of the gastrointestinal tract from the mouth to the anus. So it's really, it's an autoimmune inflammatory bowel disease that really can present a lot of different ways. It's typically thought of the small intestine, but small and large intestine, but it is able to manifest a lot of different ways, and it causes, again, severe GI tract damage, and it will obviously result in GI symptoms. Now, for a Crohn's workup, obviously see your medical doctor. Step 1, always your starting point. Step 2, I would again consider Cyrex Labs Array 5 multiple tissue antibody panel that will screen for the ANCA and ASCA antibodies that are associated with inflammatory bowel diseases. Those are good markers to look at. And then if you want to understand more of a sequential workup and more of an overview of Crohn's disease, you can go to the Medscape link that I have on my slide, or that's in our references, and I'll also have it in the notes if you're on YouTube or another platform. So when you're looking at this these symptoms that you're having, these GI symptoms, if it's autoimmune in nature, or if you have autoimmunity but you don't know if it's the gut, and if you learn that it's autoimmune, there is a model that I think is really helpful to look at to better understand potential triggers and drivers of the autoimmune process. To help you, if you use this model, I think it's the best way that I know of, that I've seen, to organize what is happening and look at potential immunological triggers and drivers of the process, to help you see what's happening and formulate a dietary, lifestyle, and nutritional supplementation strategy to do your very best to dampen that process. And this is called this is the Triad of Autoimmunity. And so the Triad is obviously 3 things that contribute to environmentally induced autoimmunity. And so if you can see my screen, it's a Venn diagram. So I have 3 circles, and the circles overlap, and in the center you have something in common with all 3 circles, and that's basically the environmentally induced autoimmunity is in the middle. Now, the 3 components that contribute to the environmentally induced autoimmunity are immune system dysfunction, environmental triggers like foods, pathogens, and chemicals, and breached barrier systems like the intestinal barrier system, or leaky gut, or intestinal permeability, the blood-brain barrier breach, or the lung barrier, or any of your barrier systems. And there are several throughout the body that are where the outside world interfaces with the inside world. And when that happens, you have an immunological barrier. And if that barrier becomes compromised, then things from the outside can move inside and trigger an inflammatory response. And this is I think, the very best model I've ever seen at looking at trying to understand the triggers and drivers to autoimmunity. Now, it's important to understand that autoimmunity is not curable based on today's science. It's not. We don't know how to do it. I'm hoping in the near future that we're going to figure it out, but this is incredibly complex science. And, it's something that I'm hopeful to see, but we're not quite there yet. So this is the lens through which I like to look at autoimmune conditions, because people are trying to figure out, what can I do? Well, I developed, a model based on detect the problems, remove the problems, and repair the damage. That's the theoretical model. And I call it the Hashimoto's doctor method, but really it's just a good clinical model to try and help understand what's happening, put together strategies to improve, if possible, what's going on, and to help the person heal so that they can live their very best life possible. So as a clinical model, as a model that I use, it's really helpful to try to gather information, get the right testing to try to give us clues as to what's driving or triggering the immune system, and then remove those things from the person's diet or from their environment as best we can to try and remove immunological triggers. And then we work to really repair the damage and support healing the best that we can. And that is I have a video on our website where you can watch. I walk through the entire model and exactly how it works. But this is a good theoretical model that's worked with a lot of the people that I've consulted with. So that's a good way to think about it. If you're dealing with an autoimmune process, understand the triad of autoimmunity, that there's immune dysfunction, there are typically immunological triggers, right? So typically food proteins, chemicals, pathogens. And then there are compromised barrier systems. And all three of those things have to occur for environmentally induced autoimmunity to occur. Okay. And then once you understand that framework, then you can say, okay, well, what do I do about that? Well, then what I suggest, what I think is the best approach based on my current knowledge, is to take a framework of detect the problems to the best of your ability, detect triggers, detect and survey physiology to try to understand if there are vitamin mineral issues that might be contributing to immune dysregulation. Are there chemical exposures that might be contributing to immune dysregulation or autoimmune reactivity? Assess the barrier systems so that you can get a baseline to try to understand their integrity or lack of integrity, and then you formulate a plan based on that data. So detect, remove the triggers the best that you can, support the physiology, and then repair the damage. And the goal is to try to dampen the autoimmune process or put it into remission if we're lucky. But this is every single person has a unique response. I mean, there's a term, bio individuality, that I cannot emphasize enough. That is so important. And I was just listening to a podcast today, as a matter of fact. Rhonda Patrick she's great. She has a PhD, and she's a researcher, and she interviews fascinating people, and she has a really high level of understanding of so many topics on a molecular level. She really goes deep, and she was interviewing someone today, and I should really look this up. But she was interviewing someone today on the microbiome, and it was so fascinating to listen to researchers actually talk about what they see in the lab, and how you know, different people, or you can have two people that eat the same food, but yet their gut reacts differently to the same food that you would even think would be beneficial. And it's so, when we see people that have like autoimmune conditions, or we see there's GI tract bacterial imbalance, oftentimes I'll be like, okay, well, we got to do these things to support the gut. And really, you want to just, you do want to try to stick with, and this is obviously my opinion here, you want to stick with overarching strategies that in general tend to improve health. But you've got to also realize that every single person, their bacteria can respond absolutely differently to the exact same thing. So you can't just use the same protocol or the same things and expect the same outcome with every person, because the bacteria literally respond differently. And there's all these factors that go into contributing to the individual's bacterial colonization, and that's different from one person to the next. I mean, it was such a fascinating podcast that she put out. I was really appreciative of her work and time that she put in. You should definitely go check out her podcast if you haven't heard it. She's great and does some amazing work. So there's a lot of complexity here, and I don't want to oversimplify this and make it seem like anyone, including myself, we have this figured out, because we don't really have this figured out. But we definitely, I've seen great improvements in a lot of the people that I've worked with. I've seen, and I always like to use this disclaimer. People are like, "Oh, great, you're really instilling a lot of confidence in me." I'm like, okay, I'm just going to be straight up with people, because that's how you got to be, because that's the truth. I've worked with people that have done wonderful with recommendations I've given them and these theoretical concepts that you think are going to help people. Seen them do wonderful. I've seen other people not change, and I've seen other people get worse. Now, fortunately, more people improve than not, and it's a low percentage of people that often that won't get any improvement, or that might get worse, but that still happens. So you've got to understand that you just have to try to do the best that you can with the information and the science that we have today. But we're making great progress, and there's a lot of reasons to be, positive and hopeful. So, I think that's an important thing to understand and not lose sight of. So, in summary, if your digestive problems are not improving, there's a few things to keep in mind. Gastrointestinal autoimmunity is a cause of digestive symptoms that you need to consider, especially if you have, already have an autoimmune diagnosis, let's say like Hashimoto's, for example. Celiac disease, ulcerative colitis, and Crohn's disease are the most common. And I gave you, if you go back in the slideshow, I gave you some slides, and in the references there are links to Medscape and a few other places for a lot more information. Great overview of what the diseases are, how they're diagnosed. All of that information is there. Autoimmune conditions have familial links and have more and more than one is possible. Okay, so familial links. So if anyone in your family has an autoimmune condition, you're more likely to have an autoimmune condition because you probably have similar genetics, and that predispose you if you get exposed to the right environmental triggers. Okay, so and if you have one autoimmune condition, you're more likely to have a second one. The last thing that I really want to say about this is that don't lose hope, because there today there's more information and there are more tools available than we've ever had before to help people with autoimmunity. So, there's there's a great information out there, and there's a lot of hope. So don't lose hope. There's a lot of positive things that are happening. I suggest incorporating a detect, remove, repair approach. Talk to your doctor if you and work with them to get a starting point, so you can at least get some kind of diagnosis and a workup done, and then from there you can incorporate some additional things. I would consider Cyrex Labs testing array number 2, which is the intestinal permeability screen, array number 3X, which is the wheat uh, proteomic reactivity screen and autoimmunity panel, and array number 5, which is the multiple tissue antibody panel. If you can get those are awesome. They really help, and they add a lot of value to understanding what you're dealing with. I would consider partnering with a functional medicine practitioner as part of your healthcare team. They could really help you to put together some of these pieces and stay positive. So no matter what's happening, no matter the cause of the problems, there's always hope. If you are struggling with a lot of these problems, you're dealing with these issues, and you're looking for a potential dietary change or lifestyle recommendations, you might want to check out our transformation program to really support. It's designed to support autoimmunity and optimal thyroid physiology. You can go to thyroidprogram.com and you can learn more if you're interested there. The program is just about free. We charge $1 for it currently, and we literally do that because of spam registrations when I offered it free. We would just get bots registering accounts. So when we charged $1, we were able to put up that barrier and no more bots. So you can go to thyroid, THYROID program.com and learn more about that. If you need one-on-one help, if you would like to see if you're a candidate for working with me, I work with people across the United States and around the world. You can just go to drbradshok.com to learn more. That's drbradshok.com, and you can learn more about working with me. But I appreciate you hanging out with me today. It looks like our references slide. Interestingly enough, if you're watching this, I'll make sure to change this, but I'll post it in the show notes for sure. All of our links must have white text, so our slide background is white, and that's funny. So cool. But I appreciate you hanging out with me today. I hope you've enjoyed it. And last but not least, remember, the information that I've shared here is not designed to provide you with medical advice, a professional diagnosis, opinion, or treatment. Make sure that you talk to your medical doctor before you make any changes, before you do anything with diet, supplementation, anything at all. Make sure you talk to your doctor so that you can really work with a healthcare professional to get the guidance and care that you need. But I do appreciate you hanging out with me today, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.